Well, the fifth annual BRICs summit commences in Durban tomorrow. The hope is that a business council will be launched. Their leaders from respective countries have already been nominated. South Africa's nominees include African Rainbow Minerals Executive Chairperson Patrice Motsepe and Business Unity South Africa's CEO Nomaxabiso Majakweni. And joining us on the line to chat about China's role in BRICs is Ross Anthony now, who's from the University of Stellenbosch's Center for Chinese Studies. Thanks so much, Ross, for joining us on the line this morning. Let's run through the significance as you see it, first of all, of South Africa playing host to the fifth summit.
Well, it's a rotational host system, so I guess it's South Africa's turn to do it. I mean, it of course doubles up with the importance of particularly the China-Africa relation, Xi Jinping visiting so recently into his presidency. So it certainly puts South Africa on the map. I mean, the question is, if there wasn't a BRICS summit at the moment, I wonder if, for instance, China's leader would be visiting South Africa at the time, but it is fortuitous.
So now that we have him here on our shores, I mean, how do we leverage off this position, and what do you see the significance of the President Xi Jinping's presence on the continent being?
Well, I think it's sending a strong message of the sustained nature of the China-Africa relationship, and particularly Xi's desire to keep things going in the direction they have been for the last 10 years or so. So, I mean, on the South African side and African side in general, I mean, Africa really needs to get its game together and coordinate a better policy toward engaging with China, because after all, China is one country, Africa is 54, and so it's much easier for China to have a coordinated response in dealing economically with Africa. So definitely from the South African side, it needs to get a better bargain from China. It needs to insist more on technology transfers, and also change the current trade pattern, which sort of mimics a core periphery trade pattern of resources out and manufactured goods in.
So where a lot of criticism has been leveraged towards the likes of China for its strategy when it comes to pursuing business on the continent, a lot of that onus needs to be placed on the African leadership themselves. Ross, what extent of a gap are we looking at here that needs to be closed?
Well, if you basically China, it's in China's own interest to invest more in the African continent. I mean, it does do a lot already in terms of aid projects and infrastructural development and soft loans and this sort of thing. But really, these things are only parts of it. You need far more partnerships. You need a technology transfer so that Africans also are able to harness the knowledge and that the Chinese side has. I mean, China's already done this in some senses. You see these special economic zones they've set up in various places, such as Zambia, Ethiopia, Egypt, Mauritius. They haven't worked too well yet, but I think that the idea is a very good one, in the sense that if you're focusing more on sort of helping, giving Africans employment and giving them technology transfers. This is also in China's interest, because if this economic relationship continues the way it is, China's rhetoric of friendship and harmony will ring increasingly hollow. So it's in Chinese interest to actually further develop the economic prosperity of the African countries, because that will make the relationship far more sustainable.
Ross Anthony from the Center of China Studies at Stellenbosch University joining us on the line. Joining us now in studio for another perspective is on those BRICS expectations is Chris Hart. He's investment strategist at Investment Solutions. Chris, thanks so much for joining us this morning. So we've had a lot of comments being made that we're looking now at BRICS being more a political grouping than an economic one.
That's right,
so let's get your response to that, because I'm finding very few out there who managed to contest this view.
No, exactly. I think when you actually speak to businesses, and this is what we found in Brazil and also in India, etc., when you actually ask, whether BRICS, etc., has any relevance from a business point of view, the answer is generally no. Mm-hmm. Okay, and basically the BRICS concept really was thrown out by an economist, in 2001, as a loose sort of concept. It was, I don't think, intended to be a formalized grouping, because in a sense these countries really have quite disparate and in many instances very, very competitive and competing interests rather than overlapping interests. And so if it just remains a political body or political grouping, it probably will not stand the test of time. You have to actually have some economic and business, how can you say, common ground to actually keep this going as a formal grouping.
Chris, and yet we've got conversations being had, proposals being put on the table around plans to endorse, a reserves pool, a development bank.
Right.
I mean, how viable is something like that?
Well, that's the point. That's part of the political process, trying to actually gain or generate some overlapping economic interests. So if you've got a common development bank where you've got members pulling finance, different, using it to access finance, that'll be there. But I think it will also maybe create the start of a generation of a multipolar world, in the sense that I have a feeling that a development bank, a BRICS development bank, won't necessarily stick to the dollar as a as their base currency.
Yeah.
The trouble is what currency will be used, and they're talking about pooling reserves. Now, I can't think of any reason why you'd pool reserves other than to think of some sort of common currency arrangement between the BRICS countries, which would be quite important from a world trade point of view. So that's one of the ways they could get it. And then, of course, to form a business council to try and have businessmen interacting basically off a BRICS platform can help make BRICS more relevant. But I suspect what will ultimately evolve is that you'll start to include other countries like Indonesia, maybe Mexico, and that kind of thing. Also, you could say reasonably large emerging markets to actually make the BRICS grouping more a senior emerging markets grouping rather than just the original four.
With all that's going on in the developed markets, of course, increased emphasis has been placed on the emerging markets as a whole. And I came across an article that had a very interesting comment this morning. It said, as intellectually comforting as it is to think that such seemingly low-risk, high-return markets exist, referring, of course, to the emerging markets, it's necessary to remember that most emerging markets, including all four BRICs, are not immune to the global downturn. So that's something that we've got to remain cognizant of all the time.
It's not immune to the global downturn, but what we have already seen with this previous downturn was the developed world are just struggling to get back to their production levels and output levels that they reached in 2007. Many emerging markets have already regained their previous production levels and output levels and have gone on to exceed that by quite a considerable margin. So yes, the slowdown is there. It's what I call the differentiation between emerging markets and the developed world. It's not a decoupling. The coupling is still there, but there's certainly differentiated performance, and that's the big, I think, the big thing to watch.
There's differentiated performance. There's also, as you highlighted earlier, divergent, goals at play when it comes to these BRICS economies specifically. You listened to the conversation that I was having with Ross a little earlier, and he highlighted that as much as we need Africa to start, singing from the same hymn sheet and getting their trade and economic policies up to scratch, the onus is to a large extent on China as well in terms of developing this relationship so that it can leverage off the opportunity.
But that again is where the fallacy is that Africa must get its act together. It'll be different countries in Africa having their own particular approach with China and other BRIC countries. My sense, though, is that India is probably a better business partner than China, in the sense that China does have global ambitions. They want to actually ultimately challenge the US in terms of global dominance, etc. Whereas the Indian experience is they've been a colony before, they don't ever want to be there again, and they certainly don't want to behave like a colonizer. So your business partnerships are a lot, I think, on a more even platform. But one of the things that the BRICS countries have to get right is the ease of doing business. It's Brazil, India, China, etc., are not great places to do business. From a number of points of view, they all score quite low down on ease of doing business in that sense. And I think where the economic relevance can come is if you can get bilateral and multilateral arrangements, even within the BRICS grouping, that does make trade easier and investment easier with investment protection agreements, etc., that may actually work. But effectively, the bureaucracy, red tape, corruption are huge problems.